So thank you everyone again for joining us this evening. It is our 9th webinar and we are delighted to have you. Please make sure your cameras are off and your microphones on mute, and be aware that we are recording the session today. We are delighted to have a panel of people join us today. So we've got Charlotte and Sarah as usual with us, but we also have Helen Brown. She is an advanced diabetes and sports nutrition dietitian that's working with us at Addenbrooke's Hospital, as well as we've got James Woodman, and I will fully introduce him later when he's going to talk a little bit about his experience of exercise and using the CamAPS system. Let's hand over to you, Sarah.
Yes, thanks. So we're going to take you through some of the parts of kind of managing type 1 diabetes that are more difficult to have black and white rules for. So a lot of the things we'll be going through around exercise, physical activity, meals, other life events, alcohol, are kind of general rules and guidelines that you can then use as a starting point, and sort of and work from some of the sort of guidelines we'll perhaps go through that might be helpful. So I think, Candice, if you go to the next slide, thank you. So we'll whiz through. Helen's going to talk about physical activity and exercise, and then I'm going to go through complex meals and alcohol, and then we'll move on to some other life events with Charlotte. So to start off with, Helen is going to talk through physical activity and exercise.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. So I wanted to start with this background slide because it's a good first step in managing activity. It's a good idea to try and understand why do the blood sugars react differently to different exercises, and it seems sometimes very unpredictable and very erratic and hard to know how to manage things. So we like to start by categorizing the kind of exercise or activity that you're doing into these 4 basic kind of groups. So as you can see here, we've got aerobic exercises, anaerobic exercises, mixed sports, and also flexibility and stretching. So aerobic is a big one. So this is where your body uses oxygen for energy, and it's your things like cardiovascular, running, walking, swimming, things that get your heart rates going, and they tend to lower your blood sugars. So they tend to have a lowering impact. They tend to be lower intensity, perhaps for a slightly longer duration. Then there's anaerobic, which basically means without air. So it's making energy without the use of oxygen. So these are your very short, sharp, very intense, high intense workouts. So things like weight training, sprinting, very sort of short. And they tend to be very intense, very low, very short in duration. And they tend to have a slightly rising impact on your blood sugars. And then things like flexibility, stretching, Pilates, yoga. Everyone's different, of course. The trend throughout all of this is that everyone's different, everyone's individual, that you need to find your own strategy. But we tend to find those exercises have a lesser impact in the glucose levels. And then the big one is the mix. So all the team sports, football, tennis, hockey, kids in the playground, they tend to, it might go up at periods of time, it might go down at periods of time. So trying to find which trend you're seeing with different exercises is a really good place to start. Okay, so a little bit scientific, a little bit of the background for anyone interested. So why do blood sugars drop with aerobic and lower intense, longer duration sport? So it's all to do with the sensitivity of the muscles to the glucose. So we know that when you start exercising, your muscles become a lot more sensitive to insulin, and to about 20% in some cases. So you don't need as much insulin to do the same job. And it's because things happen within the cell, within the body, that all the transporters move to the surface of the cell, and it helps take on board that glucose. So it helps to explain a little bit why that lowering effect can be seen with those cardiovascular exercises. And the effect of that can actually last for several hours later. So the longer you've done your sport, perhaps the more intense, the more energy you've used, the more of those receptors are around in your body, then we do notice that for several hours later, potentially, especially overnight, if you've been exercising in the afternoon, can go on and on. So we need to be thinking about the impact of exercise later on in the day into the night as well. Why does it go up? So this tends to be the biggest surprise for people. Is, most people get a feeling that when they exercise, their blood sugars drop, and they either need more carbohydrate, they need to adjust their insulin. But some people are a little bit flummoxed as to why do my blood sugars go up? So we know that anaerobic, so those short, sharp bursts, those intense weight training, those sorts of exercises, they tend to be quite adrenaline fueled. And we know that your body releases a lot of adrenaline amongst other hormones when you tend to do those kind of exercises. And it has this temporary increasing spiking effect effect on your glucose levels. And again, that can actually hang around, and often people come out of the gym and they're a little bit higher. Their temptation is to give a lot of insulin straight away, but we know that actually just leaving it for sort of half an hour, hydrate, allow the blood sugars to come down slowly, can actually help avoid those post-exercise drops that we might see. So we know that anything really adrenaline fueled, and it also helps to explain why on match day your blood sugars might act completely differently to just the training day on a Wednesday evening. And so the kind of the context of the exercise can have a big impact on blood sugars as well. And any sports doing lots of lactic acid, so when your legs feel really tired after a run, often you've produced a lot of lactic acid. That in itself can also drive glucose into the bloodstream, so it can help explain why some people get a little bit of a spike towards the end of a 10K run or the end of an intense session as well. Okay, we've put this in here. It's a really, like we said earlier, or what James would also talk about, is one of the most useful tips that we have for people that are interested in getting active or doing exercise on insulin is trying to minimize the amount of active insulin on board. So when you eat something, you're obviously bolusing insulin, and so that will peak around 1 to 2 hours after you've bolused it. So we know that can almost make it more unpredictable when you're going into exercise. So having any kind of active bolus on board when you're exercising tends to throw a big spanner in the works. And they've actually done that with some research, and this is quite a nice study just showing what you can achieve. So by exercising in a fasted state, so what they're really saying is they haven't eaten anything for that 1 to 2 hours prior to exercise, and they haven't bolused extra insulin. It helps with the predictability of glucose levels with sport. And they've actually reproduced that in several other studies as well. So we spend a lot of time in clinics saying, look, if you're going to go to the gym, try and go maybe before breakfast if you can, rather than just after breakfast, or try and leave it a little while, 2 to 3 hours after a meal, so you don't have that active kind of bolus of insulin around in your system when you go to the gym or go out into the garden or whenever. Okay, so with this system then, the CAM app, what we can do is we can help minimize the amount of insulin that's active in the system by using the ease off feature, which hopefully people that are using the system have started using already. So what you can do there is temporarily just allow that buffer, allow the insulin levels in the body to be reduced in time for that exercise. And some people may find that if they're doing a very adrenaline fueled, intense exercise, they may not need to put that on. They may find that actually the algorithm helps deal with the high blood sugar as they're doing the session. But for the majority of people, we tend to say you're likely to see a drop in any kind of habitual sport or activity that you're doing. So the key is to try and get that insulin out of the system as early as you can, not too early, because then you'll end up going into exercise with a high blood sugar, but trying to get the ease off going about 90 minutes seems to be the key to really try and minimize the amount of active insulin when you're actually going through the gym doors, or you're heading out for your run or your walk. And it can be really effective to keep that ease off going as well. We saw earlier that some of those transporters in your body that are used to help bring the glucose into the body where it can be used as energy, that effect can last for several hours later. And we certainly know that afternoon exercise can really increase the risk of going low overnight. So in some cases, we say to people, put the ease off even overnight, put it on for 6 hours overnight. You can always learn from experience. If it doesn't work, you could always change your strategy for next time. But what's really nice here is you can use your planned ease off as well. So you can set your ease off to come on at a certain time, because you know that you'll probably forget 90 minutes before you go to the gym. You can kind of plan for that as well. You may find also that after you've exercised, because of that sensitivity that you've generated in your body, you may find that you don't need to add as many carbs into the system afterwards, because your body just doesn't need as much insulin to do the same job. So we talk about making some small adjustments to any kind of meal bolus that you might be having after the exercise. And sometimes doing all these things, taking the reins and coming out of the closed loop mode can actually be beneficial. It doesn't mean that you failed. Some people say, it's actually easier to take the reins and use a temporary basal rate, or use, some kind of meal bolus adjustments that the algorithm may not offer you if you're in the closed loop mode. So it doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means that you found your strategy that works for you. And what we've noticed with the closed loops, with these algorithms, is that actually it's the glycogen replenishment, it's after the activity that they really come into their own in helping just to automate the insulin adjustments as it goes through the rest of the day. Okay. A new way of thinking at exercise. So we used to, before the dawn of CGM and closed loop algorithms, we're obviously focusing a lot on carb replacement, getting extra carbs into your body before you exercise to buffer that effect of going low. But now we have the beauty of CGMs, and we can think a lot more dynamically now about where my blood sugar is at the time, which will then influence what we do to help with that. So in some situations, you may need to have a few extra carbs to buffer that drop. Even with an ease off on, you may find that you need a little bit of extra carbohydrates, which we can drizzle in over the session rather than having it all in one go. We need to be wary that using CGM, obviously the system is driven off CGM, we just need to be aware of the potential extra considerations around exercise. So we know that the body increases in volume, which may impact on the accuracy of continuous glucose monitoring, or Dexcom in this case. We know that the body temperature changes a lot, and things might just make the interpretation of the sensor a little bit different. So we tend to recommend maybe setting your glucose alert in your app. You might want to set it a little bit higher than you would tend to have normally. You may have something 3.5 or 4. We might say just for the exercise, pop it on maybe 5.5, just to allow for that potential lag time that might occur with the sensor when you're exercising. And some people may choose to put a fall alert as well. So you can also sort of choose between the two fall rates when you're going into exercise too, which would normally drive you nuts. But if you're in the gym, you might find that helpful. Okay, and we said earlier about thinking dynamically. So there's no two sessions. What drives people mad, people tell us, is that it's they go to the gym, they do the same thing. One time it works, one time it doesn't work. So we encourage people to sort of take each session as it goes. And some people might find this helpful. It might be too going into the nitty gritty too much. But there is a little school of thought now via XDOD, which is a organization that are working hard on trying to simplify tips and strategies for exercise. But looking at the Dexcom and thinking, right, is my blood sugar in target? Am I happy? Is it above 7 going into the exercise? I'm happy with my ease off and all good. I don't necessarily need any extra carbs. But some people, if they see a downward trend, their blood sugar is 7 to 10, but they notice the Dexcom pointing downwards slightly, then they may choose to have a little bit of carbohydrates around the time of actually going into the exercise itself. So there's tables that we've got here. I mean, there's other resources as well that we can share. Again, to sort of, some people like a nice strategy going into these sorts of things. And if you're below 5, you'd certainly want to replace the carbohydrate before you go into the exercise. If you notice your blood sugar is 6 or 5 and 5.5, you're about to go for your walk, but you notice a downward arrow, then that might influence how many extra carbs or a little carb snack that you might choose to have and just drizzle in as you're going. You probably appreciate that it's important not to do this too far ahead of the exercise, because then the algorithm, the sensor will get excited, it will start to go up, and your pump will start to, the algorithm will start to drive more insulin into your system, which is the last thing you want when you're about to then start using that exercise. So it's important to do this sort of around the exercise itself, and drizzling it in over the session. And there's been some work done here. This is an example. If you really want to drill down and find strategies, XDOD talks a lot about using your body weight to influence how much carbohydrate you may need to buffer blood sugars and energy levels throughout a session of activity. So one way of doing it, a very basic way that's very popular, is maybe using 0.5 grams of kilo per body weight per hour of activity. And again, we talk about drizzling in over, so maybe every 20 minutes, having a little glance down at the Dexcom and having a look at the trend arrow. Is it pointing up? In which case I could probably stretch it for another 20 minutes. Is it starting to point down? In which case I might need to default to some of that drizzle effect, that carbohydrate, just to kind of keep your blood sugars as steady as possible. And we're looking at overall energy as well. It's not just about the blood sugars, it's about energy levels and making sure that your body's fueled up for the exercise. For those longer, more serious events and those more serious athletes may need to look at that a bit closer. So some work by some of the crew at Birmingham, they've developed a kind of like a dynamic calculator. So you put in your body weight, and it automatically calculates roughly how many grams of extra carbohydrate you might need to drizzle in every 20 minutes throughout the exercise, which you can manipulate by adding in your different body weights, which I thought was quite clever. There's lots of things out there that can help make it as user friendly as possible. And then we said earlier about even if you find that coming into manual mode for the actual exercise itself just works better for you, what we have noticed, several studies have shown that closed loop overnight can really come into its own. It can really, and what you see there is the insulin delivery after an exercise session on some people with type 1 diabetes. So going to bed at 10 o'clock and then just monitoring that insulin delivery via the pump or via the closed loop system by 2 a.m. You can see the variability that the closed loops offered there to protect against hypoglycemia or low blood sugars overnight, which has really helped. So even if you don't have it on for the actual session, switching it on when you finish the session and let it do its thing, let it increase, decrease, do its thing, has really shown its benefits there. Which I'm sure James, let me introduce James, who is we've used a few times for these kind of sessions, and I'll let you take the reins.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to be here. Nice to have the chance to talk to you all. I should say I could very easily go on and talk about this for about an hour, I think, and probably say loads of stuff that the others will do better. I've been told I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and keep things very, very simple and I hope helpful. I should start by saying that I've got just under a year's experience with CamAPS FX now. I first used it for a month in 2016 as part of a clinical trial, and then I went back to standard pump therapy, but it left me kind of wanting more. It was a bit of a wake-up call, experiencing closed loop back then. Since then, I've used pretty much every single one of the DIY closed loop systems that you might know about. They're all brilliant in different ways, but I ended up coming full circle back to CamAPS FX as a paying customer in June last year. I have to say I'm really pleased I made that choice. The thing I really like about this system is that it works very successfully for me, and I don't have to make lots of decisions or input or provide lots of support to it. Some people love tinkering with technology. I actually really like leaving it alone, and I'm now at the stage where I'm confident that CamAPS FX generally makes better decisions than the ones I make myself. I'm consistently getting 90% time in range now, or even better some of the time. And that simplicity applies to exercise too, because there isn't that much that you can adjust with this system. You've got the ease off setting that backs off the insulin delivery a bit, and that's about it. I really like that, and I find that it actually makes exercise pretty straightforward to the extent that it can be with type 1. If I can go on to my next slide, please, Candice. The team planning this session chose this day as a good example to share of ease off during exercise. I'd looked back actually at my diary, and appropriately enough, this was a day when I was going to the hospital for my retinopathy screening appointment. And I remember I was late, and it was kind of a jog to get there on time. You can see that yellow hatched area either side of 10 o'clock, which is where ease off is active. I think we talked about 90 minutes before. I think I actually switched it on maybe half an hour before I started the activity, because I could see a sort of downward drop and knew that I was going to be moving faster than I expected. There was that sort of downward trend on the graph for an hour or so. And actually where it's going down to about where the mouse is now, I would have done exactly what Helen was just talking about and set my low blood glucose alert to trigger at about 5.6. So I would have had that alert, had a few wine gums to turn the trend around. And then as I saw the graph start to climb again, I switched off ease off just after 11 and left the algorithm alone really from that point to get on with things, which it did very well. You can see another burst of ease off right at the end of the day, that other yellow area, which actually is a great example of me interfering with the algorithm when I shouldn't have done. I saw that kind of downward trend just before that and tried to help out by switching on ease off. And I've learned that in general, it's best not to do that. Actually, you get better results when you leave it alone, except maybe in that situation where you've had an unusually hard day of exercise and you want to get less insulin overnight while your muscles recover. That wasn't an example of that. I don't think that was what I should have done there. When it comes to judging easing off, I think the time of day plays a big part for me. I know I'm pretty insulin resistant first thing in the morning, so I probably would never use ease off for exercise before about 9 a.m. because if I did, I'd go too high. If I could go on to the next slide, we've got some kind of random top tips that I sent an email over to the team with some thoughts about everything I've learned, and they've kind of pulled them together on these next couple of slides.
Quick question, James. Can you elaborate on what exercise you actually are involved with doing?
Yeah, just generally, yes.
Yeah, just generally.
Bit of everything, some running, cycling. I've actually started rowing on a rowing machine again recently. I am supposed to be going kayaking on Saturday, which will be a new thing I haven't done for a few years. Kind of nothing massively seriously, but actually most of the time, actually when I'm thinking about ease off, it's often in the context of just doing stuff with children or going for a walk into town or briskly walking to school to pick kids up, that kind of thing. It's pretty broad picture. I'm not a dedicated specialist in any one thing, but it helps with everything. Yeah, so these are there's a couple of slides of top tips that just came from an email that I wrote with some thoughts about what I've learned over the last year or so. And actually, I won't go through all of these in detail because they actually all come back to exactly the same point, which is that exercise gets easier the less insulin you have on board. And I really can't stress that too heavily, because I think we all know that it can be very difficult exercising with type 1, but it gets easier the less insulin you have floating around, and learning that has made my life easier in many ways. I'm a big fan of exercise while fasting, particularly the time in the morning before I've eaten or had a bolus. It's a great time to exercise and keep things simple. I know some people can be a bit skeptical about exercising without having had any food. I'd say for me, it's fine. I ran the London Marathon fasting. I wasn't using closed loop. I couldn't have done that if I'd had to bolus for breakfast. It would have been impossible. So all the points really on these slides, everything that Helen has said as well, I think, point to the same thing. Get your insulin on board as low as you can before you exercise, and ease off really helps with that. You just kind of learn what the right timings are for you. On the next slide, I think we talk about, kind of cancelling ease off before you finish to avoid going too high later. For running, generally speaking, depending on what the graph was doing, I'd probably cancel ease off a mile or so before getting back home. For walking, maybe 20 minutes before I finished. I've learned you learn that based on what happens when you stop. I think you learn if you go too high consistently, then you probably need to cancel these off earlier than you thought you did. Helen has mentioned this, and so have I, that if you've had a really intense day of exercise, ease off can help you avoid going too low overnight. I think Helen was talking about 5 or 6 hours. Generally, I think I go for maybe 3, but kind of pitched around the time when experience tells me that I might go too low. I've mentioned the target thing already, kind of adjusting your low alarm higher than you would normally have it, so you can use it as a warning that you're going downwards. And then when it does go off, assuming you can stop and change it, changing it a bit lower, change it to 5 or 4.9 or whatever, so that you get another warning if the trend carries on in the same direction. I have to say that things will be even better and easier when we get back to having when we get blood glucose readings on a smartwatch. That's the main feature that I miss from my DIY closed loop days, and I know it's in the planning and is on the way soon. There really isn't much more that I can say other than that. For me, CamAPS FX works very well for exercise. It continues to work better the more I learn about the way I respond and kind of tweak things like knowing when to ease off and when to have a bit of sugar. And yeah, I think it's great. I'll be very happy to stick around and answer any questions you have in the chat or after everyone else has presented. So thank you very much, and over to Sarah.
Thanks, James. That's really helpful. And I think it's having those broad kind of starting points and having kind of working logistically through kind of what works for different things, and then adjusting your plan and not being put off it didn't quite work out that time, and sort of making a note of it and thinking, right, what will I do next time? And I think doing that is where you end up, like you say, you've been on it for a year and kind of still learning the best way to manage. So it's often not a quick fix. So moving on from exercise, just thinking about managing large or slowly absorbed meals. So the first thing I wanted to say about this is the basics still apply. It's still important to count carbs accurately, and for whatever part of the bolus you're going to give initially or altogether, trying to get that in pre-meal, so 10 to 15 minutes before you eat, ideally. And again, the same as exercise, there are no hard and fast rules as to what will work. Individually, absorption and digestion is clearly a very individual thing. So the following steps are meant to be kind of a good starting point to work from. So thanks. Next slide, Candice. So what we tend to suggest is, when you first start using closed loops, for some people, they just will put their full amount of carbs in up front, and the algorithm will just deal with it perfectly. And for some people, that's completely fine and it works well, and they don't need to worry about splitting things out. So I think that's it's worth trying in some situations, first of all, that method, because clearly one of the whole points of a system like this is to reduce the burden as much as possible. And if you're constantly having to kind of work out percentages and tinker around, then that increases burden. If that though it doesn't work for you, or maybe you're having larger amounts of carbohydrate, and historically you always needed to split the bolus when you were on a pump before, or even on pens, what we suggest is whatever split you used to use before you started closed loop, that's as good a starting place as anything else. So if you used to do 70% upfront, 30% later, start with that and work from there. Make a note of it, because you can never remember what you did, when you come to do it the next time, and what worked. So so you could just try, say you have 70% of your bolus up front, you just put that into your bolus calculator as you would have normally, with the knife and fork icon, and deliver the insulin for the 70%. And then you can just leave the system to see if the system itself can deal with the rest of the carbohydrate. And generally, if people are having more than 60 grams of carbs in one hit, then we'd probably be saying, maybe consider splitting the bolus if you're starting to have bigger amounts of carbohydrate. Next slide, thank you. If you find you're splitting the bolus and leaving the system to deal with the rest, means that the glucose kind of hovers a little bit stubbornly high above target post-meal, for a good few hours afterwards, then what you could try as the next step is giving that percentage up front, but then using boost to allow the system to be a bit more aggressive for the remaining carbs. And for some people, they found it works for them to give the bolus and then put boost on straight away. And for some people, they find it's better to give the initial upfront bolus and then preset boost to come on maybe an hour later or half an hour later. Again, trial and error, try something, make a note of it. Did it work? Revise your plan for next time if not. And I think the important thing about the time that you potentially need boost on for is we quite often see people, or even on normal pump therapy, when people split their boluses, they maybe only did their extended part of the bolus over maybe like 1 or 2 hours, but we know from a high fat high protein meal the glucose will start coming through, will continue coming through potentially for kind of many hours after you've eaten. So maybe start with 4 hours. The great thing about boost is that it will only continue to boost when you're above target. If you drop down to target or go below target, it will stop boosting even though boost was still on, and then if you crept up again, it would boost again. So it's the safe thing to do to pop it on for 6, 7, 8 hours after you've eaten, and that's fine. If you've tried those things and you're still finding your glucose levels aren't within target in the way you would like post those kind of meals, then there's been a new function that's been added to the system called slowly absorbed meal, and you find this in the add meal section of the drop down menu of the app, and I'll show you in a second where that is. And what we suggest with this is that you give your percentage upfront as you would have done before in pre-meal using the bolus calculator in the normal way, knife and fork icon, pop your carbs in there and deliver the bolus for the initial part of what you're eating. And then for the rest of the carbohydrate in that meal, input it in the add meal section in the drop down menu. So if you go to the next slide, Candice, please, you can see the 3 little lines, drop down menu, go to add meal, and then it comes up with the amount of carbohydrate. And you'd put so say it was 100 gram carb meals and you'd had 70 grams up front in the knife and fork icon of the bolus calculator, you put the other 30 grams in here and you tick the slowly absorbed meal box. And then what the algorithm does, it will give additional insulin for the remaining carbohydrate, still related to the glucose levels. So it will still relate, just won't randomly put amounts in if you're going low. It'll still be related to the glucose level, but it will give an extra 6 additional kind of shots of insulin to help cover that carbohydrate later on. So a bit more aggressively potentially than if you just used boost, a bit more targeted, I suppose. And the good thing about this is because it's glucose sensitive, some people have found that actually they say we're talking that 100 gram amount and you've had 70 and 30, actually you could even go and put a bit extra in the slowly absorbed section here, because if you don't need it, it won't give it. But if you're finding you've done the actual amount and it's still not giving you quite enough, you could overcook a bit the amount of carbs that you're adding to the add meal to make the system slightly more aggressive. So that's how that works. And I think on the next slide, we've got some examples of people who have been using this. So you can see there's a few examples there of an initial bolus going in. So in that example, there are 8 units going in of the upfront. And then you can see there's 6 other extra triangles in where the system has delivered additional carbohydrate to keep the glucose level in target. And you don't see how much the separate boluses are. They're incorporated into the basal insulin or the algorithm driven. And you can see really nicely in this example in the top right, where the bolus of 12 units has gone in up front, and actually the system hasn't really needed to give anything much extra for the slowly absorbed meal, and it's probably actually dealt with it later on. Maybe that was something that was actually much more slowly absorbed potentially. And again, another really nice example there where someone's had 10 units up front for their evening meal, and then the algorithm's given those additional pulses that are incorporated into the algorithm driven insulin that you can see below to again keep the glucose nicely in target. So there's some examples of it in action. And I think what you need to do is just experiment with the split. Like, for example, that first top left, the glucose still peaked a little bit. Oh, actually, I'm looking. Yeah, so actually, no, I'm not looking at the right thing there. What you would want to look at and see, if the glucose peaked, if you had more of a peak up front, then you might find, say you were giving 70% up front, but actually it still rose more than you'd like, so took you above initially, that you might end up thinking, okay, I actually still need more. I need 80% up front, or checking your carb ratio is right. If that initial amount kind of doesn't keep you where you want in the first place. So that's just another thing to think about. If we go to the next slide, thanks, Candice. So just having a little think about alcohol. So there's just a couple of key differences when you manage alcohol on closed loop systems compared to if you'd have been on normal pump therapy. So quite often people's method for managing alcohol was a reasonable sort of bedtime snack. That kind of safety mechanism of kind of chips on the way home, or you know, eating some toast before bed without covering it with an insulin bolus, was the sort of thing that a lot of people would have used to keep them safe overnight when the effects of the alcohol mean they don't get their normal glucose released from the liver in the way that they would if they didn't have alcohol in their system. The problem with closed loop in this situation is it's unlikely to be helpful to have a large uncovered bedtime snack, because the glucose will rise initially. The system doesn't know you've had alcohol, so the system will continue to deliver extra insulin for the rising glucose, and then that means you've got much more insulin slopping around at a time when potentially you then will become more sensitive to that insulin as you go through the night, when your liver is trying to get rid of the alcohol that you've drunk. So instead, with closed loop systems, it's probably better to approach it in a different way. And for the CamAPS FX, what we suggest is a couple of things. You could consider setting, like, and especially pre-setting, if you know you're going to go out for a drink and you might not remember to do it when you get home. It's a great thing that you can preset the ease off, a bit like Helen was saying for exercise. If you're not going to remember to put it on 90 minutes before you go to the gym, but you'll remember, you know you're doing that in the morning, and you can pre-plan to put that ease off on. If you know you're going out for drinks, you can think, actually, do you know what, I'm just going to preset ease off to run from like midnight till 6 a.m. just to kind of help keep me safe overnight. The other thing that you could also do is just consider, and again, you can do this in advance, it's consider increasing the personal glucose target just for that night. You can pop it back down again the next day, or turn it back to the factory setting of 5.8, just so overnight the system is aiming for you to be higher in the first place, so it's not going to be quite so aggressive as it would be if it was aiming for a tighter target. So they're the ways we would suggest you manage alcohol. And then I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, who's going to talk us through some other kind of life events that we get lots of questions about.
Thanks, Sarah. So moving on now, we're just going to look, so I think lots of women report sort of changes in their glucose control and their insulin doses that they're required across the menstrual cycle. And it's not been a particularly well sort of researched area. There's a few papers out there that have looked into it, but very little in terms of closed loop. But I think this is really an area where closed loop comes into its own in sort of managing variability of insulin requirements rather than having to change sort of pump settings every few days. And what studies have shown is that there tends to be increased insulin resistance during what's called the luteal phase, so the second half of the cycle. but people tend to be much more insulin sensitive at the end of the cycle, so just before the first day of menstrual bleeding. And you can see in this graph on the top right, so on the y-axis it's talking about people's insulin sensitivity, so people are more insulin sensitive at the beginning of the cycle and less towards the end, so early, mid and late luteal phase. And that can make it really challenging to have to adjust things continuously. But with a closed loop system, which is constantly adjusting your basal insulin requirements, it tends to manage it really well. I think there's only just been one study done, which was a very small study, and all it showed really was that closed loop can improve glucose control compared with sensor augmented pump therapy, but a non-automated system. But what it showed in a very small sample size, that there weren't obvious differences in glucose and insulin measures across the different stages of the cycle overall, which really just sort of points towards this really high variability between different individuals, but also within individuals. And again, it's a bit like exercise. It's a really sort of individualized pattern. So it's quite hard to give hard and fast rules about what to do. But I think closed loop certainly reduces the burden of having to check. I think people quite often have different pump basal settings for different periods of the menstrual cycle, and I think closed loop sort of takes away the need to do that. So I think it's an area that there's a bit more research to be done, but things are quite positive, and it's important to understand, similarly to like what Helen went through in terms of exercise, what the physiology and what's happening in the body, to understand what might be needed. So I think the next slide, Candice. So some of the tools which can help. So we've got obviously the automation of the basal insulin rate, which is happening without any input at all. But also people may well find that they need to use boost for several days when they're at their most insulin resistant, and this is often premenstrually. And sometimes people also need to strengthen the carbohydrate ratios during the second half of the cycle. So there may be a potential to sort of adjust those manually. And again, it's something that you can look at and see on an individual level. It's some people may find that they just don't need to, and that closed loop will automatically increase the basal to compensate for that. And I think the particularly difficult time is sort of the early stage, sort of first day of menstrual bleeding, where there's a big change from being very insulin resistant going to being very insulin sensitive, where people often get hypos at that point. So thinking about that, and whether using ease off, or if you have strengthened the carbohydrate ratios during the second half of the cycle, maybe weakening them during menstruation itself, or increasing your target glucose, just whether there's that big change to give closed loop sort of a bit of a chance to catch up as to what's happening. So thinking about some of the other sort of day-to-day life events and how closed loop can be sort of used to help with these. So I think in our last webinar, Hood Tabit talked quite a lot about stress and how this can be managed most effectively. And I think in most situations, boost is normally adequate. Hopefully for most of us, stress is relatively short-lived, and so it can be managed with boost on for a few hours, thinking about sort of work stresses and presentations, things like that, exams. But I think one thing to be aware of is that once the stress has sort of subsided, then a lot of your counter-regulatory hormones, so your adrenaline and your cortisol levels, will fall. And so just being mindful of the increased risk of hypos when that sort of stress has subsided, and just being sort of vigilant for that, and whether maybe using a bit of ease off or changing your targets once that's happened. So just to be aware of. Hopefully in the other extreme, so thinking about holidays, so I think the difficulty with holidays is so many different contributing factors to sort of your insulin variability. So you've often hopefully got different weather, you're often changing time zones, there's differences in terms of your stress hormones, you're often hopefully more relaxed. Some people do sort of high activity levels, much sort of greater activity than they would do normally. Other people go from being very, very active in their job to complete relaxation on holiday and much more reduced activity levels. There's also tends to be significant changes to your routine and often diet as well. So I think taking all of these things into consideration, it can be a really sort of difficult time in terms of glucose control. What we do think is that there's usually no need to sort of change the pump settings with a change in time zone. The phone, provided it's connected to Wi-Fi, should automatically change the pump time zone as well, but it's worth just double checking that. And in the first instance, we wouldn't necessarily suggest adjusting carb ratios and things like that just because of a change in the time zone. I do think it's really worth using ease off for the first couple of days or increasing the personal glucose target. And it's probably worth doing this by at least a couple of millimoles. So the default being 5.8, I would probably be increasing it sort of 7.58 for the first couple of days of a holiday or big change in routine, just to minimize the likelihood of hypos with that change. And again, it's with the closed loop algorithm learning, it's likely to catch up, but just where things change very dramatically. And I think this is, I know Sarah's had lots of calls about this when lots of the children at school have returned to school, and the differences between holiday and term time in terms of their routine, their activity levels, their concentration in lessons, and switching between those two. Again, just thinking for the first couple of days of each transition, just really easing off on the system to avoid hypos, which I think can be really detrimental as you sort of swing from one thing to the other. More gradual changes in routine, I think, don't necessarily require that, but for these sort of big changes over a short space of time, it might be worth just thinking about sort of making the algorithm a bit less aggressive with ease off or increasing the target to help manage those. Thanks, Candice. And topically at the moment, thinking about fasting. So it's Ramadan at the moment. And so we've had a few questions about this. So what would say in the first instance is there's probably no need to change any of the closed loop settings. What you can think about doing is increasing your personal glucose target or using ease off to further reduce the risk of hypos during the period that you're fasting. One thing just to be a bit aware of, obviously with closed loop, insulin delivery can be completely suspended for periods. And so it is worth just keeping an eye on ketones. With the combination of fasting and minimal insulin delivery, just need to be aware that you might need to monitor ketones during that. One thing that you also might want to think about, if you're eating your main meals at different times of day, so often later at night, your carbohydrate ratios at those times may not have been sort of recently adjusted. So it might be worth just reviewing, and we've covered this in previous webinars, what's happening with closed loop insulin delivery after a bolus, just to see whether those ratios need to be adjusted. Because your insulin sensitivity is often probably slightly different overnight. So just having a review of that. Something else that we've covered in previous webinars, but just as a reminder. So in terms of illness, this is generally our guidelines for adults using the closed loop system. So if you're unwell and you've got blood ketones that are greater than 1.5, we do recommend that you stop using auto mode and resume your usual pump sick day rules. And if your ketones you're not able to get the ketones down, to contact your diabetes team as you would do normally. If you're unwell and your ketones are less than 1.5, we often find that you can stay in auto mode and it will really ramp up insulin delivery. It could be quite aggressive in that, and you can use boost and also corrective insulin doses as well to ensure that you're getting enough insulin to really clear the ketones. For both situations, we'd obviously advise to continue sort of maintaining hydration, drinking plenty of sugar-free liquids and trying to eat regularly, and obviously to keep a really close eye on the glucose and ketones. I know the ketone thresholds are different in children, or if you as an individual have different ketone thresholds that you're sort of sick day rules are based on, then of course adjust that to those. But I think for sort of low grade illnesses or stress, if ketones are low, then actually auto mode is often quite good at managing those sort of low level illnesses. It can be quite aggressive in terms of the insulin delivery to help with that. So hopefully over the past 40 minutes or so, we've covered with Helen and James physical activity and real world examples of managing exercise with a closed loop system. We've looked at sort of complex meals, high carbohydrate and slow releasing carbohydrates, covered alcohol, and then a series of sort of other life events and how to use closed loop to help with management of these. And I think that takes us to Candice. Candice, I think you're on mute.
There's always one on mute, and it was me tonight. Sorry about that. So I was just saying, please keep pushing your questions through. We will get to them in a second. So I'm just giving you a minute or two to add the last questions. These are the 2 next webinars coming, so do feel free to book in with them. I think we're going to have a great discussion around closed loop and balancing sort of quality of life and living life to the full without sort of detriment to diabetes or vice versa, and then looking at closed loop therapy and living with long-standing diabetes and maybe managing some other comorbidities along with dealing with your diabetes and how people are managing with that. So before we close today, I would really like to then talk about through the questions. So let's see. So we've had a lot of questions. The first one is around what type of carbs would you recommend is the best for drizzling in sort of a cardio-based session? Does anybody have any ideas? Helen, do you want to field this one?
Yeah, so it would certainly be something very quick release, so high GI, so something that's going to get digested into the bloodstream quickly. So people are very individual over whether they want to eat or drink when they're active. So whatever's practical. So people have their own way of managing it. So things like jelly babies. James has suggested wine gums. Let's put my video on. So it'd be certainly something very quick released.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Thank you very much. There was a question around swimming. So swimming is a really difficult sport. There's lots going on. Ease off, running in before going swimming is not working. Are there other strategies that you can use for swimming? Or I know we've got some other swimmers that have some different strategies that you might have heard of. Share your thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead, Helen.
Is that one for me?
Anyone?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to keep practical, isn't it, with swimming? Often people have hypo treatments at the end of the pool, trying to keep a clock of how many lengths you've done. It's easy to lose track of time with sports and activities like that. So often people say that once they go low, it's actually quite hard to then bring things back up again. So trying to stay ahead of that curve is important. So often people might have some hydration, some water at the end of the lane with some quick release carbohydrates as well. Obviously the practicalities is difficult in a pool, and it's very obviously with competitive swimming, it's really quite competitive, so it can be tricky. It can get very wet at the end of a lane, I'm told, from competitive swimmers, so it's actually quite a hard thing to overcome. Also there's some other things there about slipping it into manual mode, if you can't get the ease off to work for you. And what I didn't mention in the exercise part is using that personalized target as well. If the ease off isn't enough, maybe moving to a personalized higher target than the ease off will allow, and sometimes just slipping it into temp basal, put it into manual mode, do a temp basal, do some manual reductions might be the thing to do.
I've even heard people actually taking the pump off and taking it off because it's around too much insulin. So seeing if maybe even taking it off half an hour beforehand and allowing the insulin to run off even before. People have different. I think we had somebody in the last session, and she was definitely taking the pump off for swimming and sort of taking it off rather than just taking it off at the pool to allow her to go up.
Yeah, she had carbs and then removes the pump, and she's a very competitive swimmer and doing it sort of every day, and that's clearly the strategy that's worked for her. But
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's kind of probably having a target of glucose level that you'd like to be before you start doing that exercise, which again will be different for different people. A lot of people will tell us like being around sort of 9-10 is a good place to start. So it's just thinking, if when you come to do, even if you've had ease off on, but you're a bit below where you'd like to be to start off, then having a small amount of carbs, but taking it out of auto mode at that point, so your glucose doesn't rise, and then it gives extra insulin for those carbs. So or taking the pump off, I think is the key thing. We've had a few people that have kind of been putting extra snacks in or having some carbs or a snack a bit before they've exercised, but then there's just been too much active insulin. So it comes back to that point that James made really nicely, that the less insulin around, the better. So there's a lot of things to consider, which is why it's so tricky, I guess.
If you want one more swimming anecdotal data point, I mean, I've always taken the pump off for swimming. I'm not a very serious swimmer, but I always take the pump off completely now. And sometimes, let's say I was kind of gently going up as I was going in, I might have a unit of insulin or 2 units of insulin before I take the pump off, and it generally works out okay. But not wearing the pump is fine for me for an hour or so.
It's probably more convenient as well, because you want to be in your costume and going swimming rather than having a pump attached to you.
I have to say, the one time I did think, well, I'm going to try out the waterproofing on the pump, and took it into the pool. My son got his leg tangled in the tubing and ripped the cannula out, and then we had to drive home and put a new one in. So it worked. It was definitely easier without.
That's life. And while we've got you there, James, can we, there's been a discussion in the chat, but I think sharing it with the wider audience around why FIASP works better for you than NovaRapid.
I have nothing other than what feels like, I mean, it's kind of instinct, I think. I don't have any data for why it's better than me, but I tried FIASP about maybe 2 years ago, and it was a disaster. I think I picked the wrong time to change. For me, I was really busy at the time and didn't have any opportunity to focus on making it work, and I gave up and went back to NovaRapid. And then I thought, actually, maybe I should try again. And it was about, I can't remember, maybe 4 months ago that I changed, I think started this year, and it just seemed to go better this time. And in terms of exercise, purely based on how it feels, but I think it clears out of my system more quickly. So I'm sure that's what the manufacturers would want you to say, but it feels true. And so in terms of getting rid of the insulin that might be hanging around after a bolus, I get to that point more quickly. And it's not I'm consciously thinking, how long am I going to wait after a meal? It's just that if I do something that involves physical activity, it's more likely that I'll have a low quantity of insulin in my system than when I was using a traditional or older insulin. And so it works better, again, without really thinking about it. So I'm not doing it in a very scientific way, but I think it helps.
The good news is we did do it in a very scientific way. So we did a randomized clinical trial where we blinded FIASP and NovaRapid and gave it to people for 2 months who were using the closed loop system in both with both of the insulins, and we found very little difference in terms of the time in range. There was a small reduction in hypoglycemia. So I think there are potentially benefits, and particularly in some individuals, they're likely to see more benefit. And I think you're absolutely right. The principle is it's faster on, faster off. So for those occasions when you are more predisposed to hypoglycemia, there's potentially more to be gained. I think some of the other ultra rapid acting insulins early are meant to be even better on the label. So we've yet to see, but I think it's definitely moving in the right direction. So I think you don't lose anything, and there's potential to gain from it. It's not quite as quick as we would like, but we always want more.
Thank you. Then there are a few related questions about the algorithm and its learning ability, and using sort of boost and ease off, or if you're not in a sort of closed loop, will that affect the learning? So they're kind of two questions about the learning sort of capability of the algorithm when using boost and ease off, and then, the learning that would maybe the pumps missed or the algorithms missed if you've actually disconnected, suspended the pump and for the exercise.
Shall I take that? So when boost and ease off are running, they're meant to be kind of things to use occasionally. So overall, when the system's doing its learning around kind of meal times and overall during the day, it doesn't take it into account, kind of like if you've put boost on because you've just gone a bit, you needed to use it because you've miscounted your carbs and you've gone a bit high and you've put boost on. It won't take that into account in terms of overall at that time of day they're seeming to need more insulin unless you're doing it, regularly. If you're having to use boost regularly because and perhaps your settings aren't right in terms of the carb ratios, then overall it will add to, as your total daily dose either increases or decreases if it's ease off as opposed to boost, then the system will be learning from it in terms of overall total daily dose. But in terms of just day to day, the use of those things, it won't learn from it as it goes along, because you wouldn't really want it to. If it's something you're having to use all the time, then other settings need taking into account and probably adjusting. Does that, I don't know if that explained it properly, if anyone wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think it's a real balance, isn't it? I think James pointed out actually letting the system do what the system's designed to do. But there are going to be occasions, of course, when you've got unannounced exercise or miscalculated a meal. Those things are a reality. So it's a tool to help glucose management during those times. Using it sort of 6-7 times a day throughout the night always fills me with dread when I look at a download, because I just think somebody's up all night. Nighttime is the time that closed loop is sort of doing its best, and actually getting up and interfering with it is affecting your quality of life, and you're not getting the most out of it. So I think I agree with you, Sarah. It's sort of a tool to be used occasionally when needed. I wouldn't be afraid of it interfering with learning, though. I think the bigger picture is it's learning the whole time. So yeah, it's a balance.
Thank you. Then there's a question, I think, for you, Sarah, about the slowly absorbed meal. So if somebody's sort of having a slowly absorbed meal that they want to use that function for, but then they're going on to, they're not quite sure what the activity is going to be over the next 3 hours or so. They're not quite sure how much of the meal they're going to eat. So if they put an extra 20 grams or 50 grams in the slow absorbed meal part, are there any dangers they need to think about?
No, I guess that would be something that would be fine. I don't know. I haven't seen anyone or kind of heard from anyone specifically using it for that reason. But I guess, like in that example you saw kind of top right when we were looking at those graphs, the additional insulin boluses is still given in relation to the glucose level. So if it was because actually you hadn't managed to finish the meal, or you were thinking you might not, and you didn't, and the glucose therefore is on the low side, the system won't deliver the extra insulin, because it will respond to the glucose levels themselves. So I guess, yeah, it potentially could be used in that way. I don't know. What do you think, Charlotte? I've not really thought about that before.
So sort of doing activity shortly after a bolus.
Yeah, or if I think the other thing was, if you were worried you weren't going to eat the whole meal, could you?
Yeah, I think if you weren't worried, it's perfect for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Activity shortly after, I think it would still depend on how much bolus was up front. So I think that wouldn't necessarily be helpful if you'd kind of given a fair whack up front. It's not, it's not going to suck the insulin back out. Yeah. So, but definitely if you kind of were worried you weren't going to eat it all, which might be a good thing for kind of, toddlers, small children, or, if you're kind of never sure. How
and
much
historically, we used to talk about it being a sort of grazing way of bolusing, those sort of canapé type things, or at children's parties. Of course, bolusing for everything that you're eating is optimal, but in those sort of situations where you don't know what your child's going to be eating or something, then maybe it's a way of sort of just priming the algorithm that there's carbs coming in, but handling them in a slightly different way than
and you're right, the bolus isn't going to be given, the extra little triangles isn't going to be given if your glucose level hasn't risen. So if you have counted 50 but only eaten 40, it's going to notice that, because your glucose won't respond in the same way for the 40 that it would for the 50.
It's a bit like Boost. I saw there's a question in the chat about Boost. So Boost will only keep boosting when you're above your target glucose. Once you're at target glucose, Boost will then only be sort of deliver insulin more aggressively when you deviate from your target glucose. So it's sort of a safer way of doing it. And this is a similar concept, so that will only continue to deliver those small boluses if your glucose goes above target. So it needs it.
No, absolutely. There's questions about sort of exercise snacks. If somebody's sort of snacking for exercise, should they announce that to the algorithm? Who's going to take this?
Yeah. So I think it comes back to this same issue of how much active insulin you've got at the start. And so what you don't want to do is on open loop or in the previous pump therapy without automated insulin delivery, people would often have kind of an extra snack before they started to get them up a bit before they started, or they would, if they were having a meal quite close, they might, if it was, they might reduce the insulin and you have like 2/3 of the insulin, or have a strategy like that. With closed loop systems, that won't work, because your glucose will rise and the system will still try and make up for it with additional insulin. So you still end up at a starting point where you've got too much insulin slopping around. So I think, like James says, the ideal is, you know, if you can exercise fasted and not have extra insulin hanging around, then that's going to be great. But then if you've got a child who's hungry before they're going to have their football match, you're not going to say, no, sorry, it'd be much better if you played your football match fasted. So you know, life gets in the way of these things. So I think in that situation, it's having a snack, but thinking, okay, we might need some insulin for the snack. What can we do to minimize it? Could we have a snack that's got slightly less carbs? Can we kind of consider the timing of this, like, for future? So, you know, can get a snack in as early as possible away from the start of football. But also it might be that that you do a snack, but you take it out of auto mode and you have a snack, reduce the insulin. And so you've not got a situation where you've got the algorithm giving the extra for the rising glucose, that you're quite happy potentially that the glucose has risen to 10 or 12 and they're at a good place to play their football match before, you know, before they start, without the system having given lots of extra additional insulin. You've already made your reduction, and you might have, I'm not a big fan of suspending the pump. I worry about that. You can end up with quite a long period of time without insulin if you're not careful, which then can cause other problems with highs later. But it might be that you take it out of auto mode, and you might, I saw someone saying, you know, when they just use ease off, it doesn't seem to drop them enough to reduce the insulin enough in advance. And actually for that person, it might be better if they take it out of auto mode and run a 50% reduced temporary basal, or even less, you know, beforehand. So it's just, you know, ease off will kind of run kind of similar to sort of minus 30% or 70% temporary basal. So it might be actually for you, that's just not enough off before you go and you start your exercise and you still drop too far. So it's all these things kind of trying to take it into account, but having the snacks in advance without taking it out of auto mode won't work.
Could I be allowed to ask a follow-up question to that?
Yes,
probably to Sarah. Just with the hypoglycemia treatment box, when you register, when you do the add meal, and there's the hypoglycemia box,
yeah.
Does that make it treat the carbs any differently? Let's say you know that you're not hypo. Let's say your blood sugar's 5 or 5.5, but you know that you're going down and you're going to be hypo in 20 minutes if you don't do something during exercise. I've got into the habit of ticking the box, thinking maybe that will make it not treat those carbs as something that it should be delivering insulin for. I don't know if that's true, but what would you do if you were eating to avoid low blood sugar? Would you treat it any differently in terms of what you logged?
So you carry on, Charlotte.
No, I was just going to say, so basically by ticking the hypo treatment box, you're sort of hiding the carbs from the algorithm, so it doesn't know that they're coming in. If you don't tick the box, it's basically like the slowly released carbs. The algorithm is primed for receiving carbohydrates. Yeah. So if you tick that when you're actually using it as a hypo treatment, it's sort of really almost the opposite of what you want to do, because you don't want to prime the algorithm as if you've got carbs coming in. So it is worth doing it. You don't need to do it for hypo treatment, because you're going to be below the target glucose anyway. So insulin delivery will have stopped and will be lower anyway. But I think some people also like to have a record of when they've had hypo treatment to help with sort of reading the data and looking back at it sort of 6-7 days later or what have you. So it depends how keen you are at sort of recording all events as a sort of learning exercise. But basically by ticking that box, the algorithm isn't aware that the carbs have sort of come in and won't handle the carbs in its usual way.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think we've covered most of the questions. I'm just aware of time. I'm just having a quick scan. We have, there's one about slow release, and if you're not eating all those carbs, obviously it won't affect you right then because it's in glucose responsive, but you know, what would the algorithm then learn to be slightly less responsive? Say you gave 50 grams of carbs but you only ate 40, it's kind of learning how much it needs to cover, thinking it's covering 50. The next time, will it change the way it works, or is it just a once off, not making much difference in the bigger scheme of the learning?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that side of things. It's
I think you can sort of overthink a lot of these things. It's doing that and having the odd time where that was the case isn't going to make any difference to it, is in a nutshell.
So it's about, you know, the things that you do routinely, it's going to learn. The odd thing that doesn't go right is fine. And then it's about individualizing, is what the message I'm hearing is about, finding out what works for you. There's no right or wrong. It's just figuring out, you know, how you are going to get the right amount of insulin and the right amount of carbs on board for whether it's exercise or eating a meal or, you know, living life.
Yeah, and I think it's trying to be strategic about it. I think it's starting with an approach, and it sounds really archaic when we're talking about clever, fancy systems on apps and things, but I think it's worth just making a note of what approach you used and at the time what happened, because next week when you do that, you think you'll remember, oh yeah, did we do so, you know, what percentage up front or the rest of it, but people kind of rarely do, and then you're kind of never kind of moving forward if it didn't work the first time, or if it did work the first time, you want to remember what it was. So I think make a note of it and sort of work through the process and until you kind of find a strategy that works for you. And it's going to be very different for different people, and that's fine. It's just trying to do it logically, I suppose.
And then just two final updates. We're unfortunately still waiting for Dexcom Follow and Clarity, the actual IT connectivity from Dexcom. We are in constant contact with them, and as soon as we get it from them, we will let you know and upload, and you will be able to connect that way. So as soon as we're able to have that information, we'll share that with you and keep you updating. But at this time, unfortunately, we don't know any better. And then we will take on board, there was a question about having information about everything, the IOB, the insulin on board, and we will discuss that and feed that back to you. At the moment, it's only sort of around the boluses insulin on board that is shown. We don't show you how much insulin is on board from the algorithm because it changes all the time, but we will take that point and feed back to you. So thank you for raising that. But at that, we're 5 minutes over, so I've done a really bad job tonight. Sorry for running late, but I think
questions.
Having that discussion and good questions. We will upload the full presentation in a day or so on the learning platform, and I also will send it via social media. And you do know where to get hold of us on camdiab.com if you need any help or any support. We are here for you, so please do touch base with us. But thank you to our panel tonight, and thank you, James, for sharing your experiences, and thank you, Helen, for taking us through that exercise. And as always, Charlotte and Sarah, thank you very much for those pearls of wisdom and experience with sharing with us. So thank you and good night, and we'll see you next time.